When the Ottomans claimed victory, the roar of battle didn't end. It simply changed its sound. The clash of swords faded into the cold rattle of chains. The men who had fought until their final breath were either slaughtered where they stood or sold into distant slavery. But for their wives, survival itself became the cruelest punishment. What followed wasn't mercy. It was a living nightmare that unfolded slowly, day after day. These women were no longer seen as human beings but as spoils of war, possessions to be claimed, traded, or forgotten. Their names were erased, their dignity stripped away, their very identities rewritten by those who believed conquest gave them ownership of the conquered. And it makes you wonder, if you were standing in that world, torn from everything you knew, how far would you go to hold on to your sense of self? The Ottomans had refined this brutality into a system. Not chaos, not spontaneous pillage, but a cold, legal machine. A structure written into law and executed with precision. These captured women had a name under Islamic jurisprudence: Sabaya, the spoils of war, and the Ottomans enforced that doctrine with chilling order. The process began instantly after conquest. Trained officers entered fallen cities and began their work with methodical cruelty. People were separated by gender and age with surgical precision, men to death or chains, women and children to the inspection lines. The wives of fallen warriors were stripped, examined, and evaluated in full view. Ottoman physicians and bureaucrats inspected them from head to toe, checking teeth, testing skin, judging fertility. Every feature was a number, every imperfection a deduction. Their youth, beauty, and health dictated their value. The youngest and most striking were marked for Constantinople, destined for the empire's elite. The older or less favored were sent to grueling labor or sold for pennies in provincial markets. What had once been noble women became livestock, appraised in open streets while strangers handled their bodies and shouted out prices like numbers at an auction. But their torment didn't end there, it only evolved. Long columns of chained captives were marched for weeks toward imperial centers. Many collapsed under the weight of hunger or exhaustion and were left behind to die where they fell. Those who endured were packed into wagons like grain sacks, suffocating, starving, but alive enough to be sold. Reaching the market breathing was already a twisted kind of victory. Yet, the markets themselves were no places of chaos. The slave bazaars of the Ottoman world were official, regulated, and taxed, built into the empire's own economic heart. In Constantinople, Bursa, and Ankara, rows of women stood in silence beneath the gaze of potential buyers. They were examined like tools, touched, tested, and criticized. Buyers judged not only their beauty but their skill, how they sewed, cooked, wove, or sang. A failed impression could mean a beating or a lowered price. There was no dignity left to cling to. Their humiliation was deliberate, an instrument of control. Women were forced to smile beneath threats, to bow in obedience, to pretend acceptance. Behind the scenes, imperial scribes recorded every detail: name, origin, age, price, building vast ledgers of suffering that filled Ottoman archives. And for the most beautiful captives, a darker fate awaited. They were sent into the empire's harems, not the romanticized palaces of later myth, but glittering prisons. The harem was a world gilded in gold but built on silence and fear. Inside Topkapi Palace, thousands of women from conquered lands lived under confinement, guarded by eunuchs and cut off from the world. Their languages were forbidden, their faiths erased, even their names replaced. A Christian woman from Hungary or Greece might awaken one morning to find herself renamed, forced to pray in Ottoman Turkish, forced to kneel in a religion she barely understood. Refusal meant starvation, whipping, or isolation in pitch-black cells. The harem was not only physical exploitation, it was psychological annihilation. Women fought for slivers of influence, for the slightest favor that could protect them. To lose status was to invite torment, sometimes death. Many never adjusted. Some lost their sanity. Others ended their lives just to escape the endless submission. The harem wasn't paradise, it was a graveyard for identity. For the wives of noblemen and commanders, the punishment cut even deeper. The victors often forced them into service under the very men who had slaughtered their families, a humiliation engineered to break the spirit of entire nations. It carried a cruel message. If your most powerful women can be owned, then no one is untouchable. The cruelty was not chaos. It was design. Every woman's name, skill, and price was written meticulously by imperial scribes. This was not mere enslavement, it was administration. Bureaucracy sharpened into an instrument of terror. To the empire, these women were no longer human beings, only figures in a ledger, proof of power inked into parchment. Their suffering was the fine print of victory. When the Ottoman conquest spread across the lands, it didn't just chain bodies, it chained bloodlines. The empire's cruelty didn't stop at enslavement. It evolved into something far darker. Captive women weren't only stripped of freedom, they were turned into instruments of reproduction for the empire itself. Every child born from an enslaved mother automatically belonged to her master. A mother could cradle her own child, yet never truly call them hers, knowing at any moment that tiny heartbeat could be taken away. Even the womb, sacred and human, became an imperial weapon. But the Ottomans went further still. They didn't just conquer lands, they conquered souls. Religion became another tool of domination. Captive Christian women were forced through hollow conversions, rituals designed not for faith, but for submission. Refusal meant torture, mutilation, starvation. Acceptance meant erasure. Once converted, a woman ceased to exist as who she once was, her faith, her name, her very past wiped from memory. Escape offered no salvation. She could never return home. Her own people would no longer recognize her. She was erased legally, spiritually, eternally. This was how the empire made conquest permanent. A battle might last a season, but the suffering of these women spanned generations. Their bodies became vessels of power, their children born into bondage, their identities ground into dust. The Ottomans didn't just want obedience, they wanted memory itself rewritten. Public humiliation became a tool of control. The suffering of enslaved women wasn't hidden behind palace walls. It was displayed for all to see. Forced conversion ceremonies became spectacles of despair, where their gods were mocked and their faith ridiculed. Refused to recite the Islamic declaration, and punishment followed swiftly. Lashings, hunger, or endless confinement in darkness. Accept, and the chains only tightened. A Christian wife transformed into a Muslim slave. No road back, no redemption. Her family could not reclaim her, her church would not receive her. Conversion wasn't salvation. It was the second death. And the Ottomans understood true destruction isn't loud. It's permanent. Even their children were used as instruments of empire. The newborns of enslaved women weren't considered sons or daughters. They were property. A boy might be trained to serve, to fight, to bleed for the empire that stole his mother. A girl might be marked to repeat her mother's fate. Raised for the same market, the same humiliation, the same gilded imprisonment. These women lived knowing they were raising the next generation of slaves. Their pain became hereditary, their wombs turned into state machinery. Ottoman scribes documented every detail. Names, ages, beauty, fertility, value. Every act of cruelty was itemized, stamped, and recorded, the paperwork of suffering. The empire had turned horror into bureaucracy. And for the wives of powerful men, the degradation was deliberate and public. They weren't hidden away in silence. They were paraded before crowds, stripped of dignity to send a message. No nobility, no bloodline, no nation could defy Ottoman power. The empire broke its enemies not just in war, but in spectacle. Still, fragments of resistance flickered in the darkness. Some women risked everything to escape, bribing guards, sending secret messages, even choosing death over bondage. Each act of defiance, however small, carried unimaginable cost. But the true devastation went far beyond individuals. Across the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East, entire generations of women vanished. Villages stood empty of daughters, mothers, wives. The human fabric torn beyond repair. It wasn't just conquest. It was demographic warfare, extermination by erasure. The scars carved by it lasted centuries. Those few who survived and returned carried more than memories. They carried silence. Many had forgotten their native tongues, forced for years to speak only the language of their captors. Others no longer remembered their prayers. And when they finally came home, some were met not with embrace, but rejection. Seen as tainted, impure, no longer belonging anywhere. They returned not as the women they once were, but as living ghosts, reminders of what empire truly meant. For centuries, historians painted the Ottoman Empire in gold and marble, praising its architecture, its administration, its might. They wrote of glory, progress, and tolerance. But beneath those polished stories lay something unspeakable. An empire built not only on conquest, but on the quiet suffering of those it silenced. In the dusty archives of Istanbul and beyond, historians began finding the truth, the receipts of human lives. Ledgers inked with pain, lists of women stripped of names, of identity, of existence itself. For generations, their voices were erased, buried under the myth of civilization. Only in recent decades, through unflinching study of primary records, has the true machinery of this empire been revealed. And what makes it most horrifying is not its chaos, but its precision. This was not barbarism without order. It was order turned barbaric. A systematic mechanism of enslavement engineered to operate cleanly, efficiently, endlessly, generation after generation. Women became entries of value, assigned worth by beauty, youth, or skill. Their suffering was legitimized through law, sanctified through ritual, and institutionalized under faith. The Ottomans perfected it so well that their methods spread outward, influencing neighboring Islamic states and setting a grim standard for centuries. The empire's cruelty became a blueprint, replicated far beyond its borders. This was not merely history. It was a lesson in how a nation can cloak its inhumanity beneath the robe of civilization. Cannons might have shattered walls, but bureaucracy shattered souls. One reduced cities to rubble, the other erased identities from existence. And in that machine, no one was untouchable. Not noble women, not commanders' wives, not even the children born within palace walls. The Ottomans proved that conquest doesn't end when victory is declared. It lingers. It survives in record books, in harems, in the bloodlines of enslaved children who would never taste freedom. Yet even that wasn't the end of cruelty. There existed something darker, a form of punishment so deliberate, so sadistic, that even the empire's own scribes hesitated to describe it. Because the Ottomans didn't just steal bodies. They stole identities. Every captured woman was renamed, her birth erased, her history rewritten in Ottoman ink. But some fates went beyond slavery. Some women weren't sold or assigned to labor or pleasure. Their suffering was crafted as spectacle public, ritualized, unforgettable. When a city resisted too long, when a general defied the sultan, his wife became a message. Captured women were paraded through the streets in chains, beaten, stripped, displayed before their broken people. Their humiliation wasn't a byproduct of war. It was a weapon of policy. A commander's wife might be forced to stand naked before the very men who slaughtered her family. Her body turned into a banner of defeat, her pain a warning carved into the collective memory of her people. And it did not end there. Some were branded, their flesh burned with iron, not as marks of ownership, but as stamps of disgrace. Others were forced into roles meant to mock the nobility they once held. Royal women who once sat beside kings were made to scrub the barracks of their captors. The wives of enemy leaders were ordered to pour wine for the officers who had killed their husbands. And when humiliation wasn't enough, death was turned into a performance. Women were locked in iron cages and hung from city gates, starving under the open sky as their people passed below, forced to witness what defiance would cost them. Days would pass before death finally came. Every hour of agony, every scream, was part of the show. But the most dreadful fate awaited those who had borne children of fallen leaders. The Ottomans feared bloodlines. They feared that someday, a son of a defeated warrior might grow strong enough to reclaim his father's honor. So they killed futures before they could begin. Infants were torn from their mother's arms, sold, executed, or vanished into silence. For a mother forced to watch her child die, the message was absolute. Resistance dies with the family. The torture wasn't only physical. It was psychological, deliberate, engineered to destroy the will to hope. Some women were forced to choose between their children, one to live, one to die, ensuring their spirit would never recover. Others were kept alive only to watch their loved ones perish before them. Their own survival turned into another layer of punishment. And through it all, every act of cruelty was recorded. Every name changed, every punishment issued, every price written down in ledgers. The Ottomans documented horror the way merchants counted gold. To them, suffering was data organized, categorized, preserved. A silent empire of pain inked across the pages of history. It was meant to prove power, and yet the cruelty didn't stop there. It evolved, sharpened, and turned even darker. Some women were transformed into weapons of conquest themselves. A commander's widow might be sent back to her own city under Ottoman rule, forced to preach obedience to her broken people. She became a symbol of betrayal, wearing her own grief as a mask. Her survival was no longer her own. It depended entirely on how well she served the empire that had destroyed everything she loved. When her people looked at her, they no longer saw the wife of a leader. They saw a puppet, a living reminder that even the proudest hearts could be bent to submission. But the empire's hunger for domination was not satisfied by control alone. Craved spectacle. There were deliberate experiments in degradation, cruel performances of power. Women were starved and then paraded before crowds, food dangling cruelly within sight but never within reach. Others were forced into fights against one another, turned into unwilling gladiators, their suffering transformed into sport for soldiers drunk on conquest. The Ottomans didn't just demand obedience, they demanded entertainment. Human agony became amusement. Faith itself was twisted into a stage for humiliation. Women who refused conversion were dragged into mosques, beaten until their trembling voices choked out the words of the Shahada. Their surrender was not spiritual. It was coerced, extracted through pain, and displayed as proof of empire's moral supremacy. Those who still resisted faced executions so slow, so methodical, that their deaths became sermons in obedience, each scream a warning to others who might defy. But the most chilling punishment of all was silence. Some women weren't killed or branded, they were erased, taken into hidden chambers, sealed away for years, unseen by the world. Neither living nor dead, they simply vanished, ghosts devoured by the machinery of empire. Their names faded from record, their memory even from those who once loved them. And yet, their absence screamed louder than any execution. Communities that witnessed such horrors were forever marked. Villages that dared to resist never forgot what they saw. Wives of leaders mutilated before their eyes. Mothers forced to watch their infants slaughtered. Sisters dragged through the streets in chains. The women who survived carried the memory like a curse. Their bodies healed, but their minds never did. Some wandered through life in silence, hollowed by nightmares of whips, starvation, and unthinkable choices. Others forgot language, faces, and home. Survival itself became another kind of punishment, a long, waking death. And the empire's cruelty continued because it worked. Fear became its greatest weapon. Terror moved faster than cavalry. Cities surrendered not because their walls were broken, but because their hearts were. Word spread of what awaited the women inside the next city's walls. And so, many opened their gates before the first cannon fired. This was not conquest by sword alone. It was conquest through fear, through women, through the destruction of identity itself. Wombs, children, and wives were turned into tools of domination, living instruments of psychological warfare. But there's a final layer, the detail that seals this story in blood. The Ottoman Empire did not see these acts as crimes. It saw them as policy. Every branding, every humiliation, every forced conversion and sale was legalized, documented, and blessed by the empire's courts. Judges, scribes, and scholars wrote these horrors into law. It wasn't chaos, it was order. This was not chaos born of passion, it was precision. It was order wrapped in cruelty. This wasn't rogue violence. It was systemic, calculated, and sanctified by power itself. The agony of these women wasn't merely tolerated. It was glorified, written into the laws and customs of empires that called themselves civilized. And that's why this story doesn't die in the dust of the 16th century. Its echo moves through time, haunting the present. Because once an empire proves that domination can hide behind the mask of legality, it sets a precedent that others will follow. Other nations watched, learned, and replicated. The Ottoman method became a silent blueprint, copied, refined, and reborn across continents and centuries. The wives of fallen warriors became the foundations of an enduring legacy. A legacy not of victory, but of systemic conquest and quiet suffering, carried forward long after their bones turned to dust. But one question still lingers, unanswered in the shadows of history. What became of those who vanished completely? The women whose names were never written, whose bodies were never found, whose stories dissolved into silence. Their fates remain unspoken, swallowed by time. And that, perhaps, is the most haunting tragedy of all. Not simply how they lived or how they died, but how perfectly they were erased, until only their echo remains, whispering across centuries, reminding us how easily power can consume innocence, and how silence can be history's loudest wound. To everyone listening, remember that behind every empire's glory lies the cost of its silence. Learn from their story, because forgetting it means repeating it. If this story moved you, take a moment to share, and subscribe to Vassal Truths, where forgotten voices are heard again, and the past is retold to awaken the conscience of the present.